and CEO of Contino5. We are currently going live across a few different platforms. So we're going to give people a moment to join, and I'm going to make sure everything's going live. So just bear with me 1 minute. All right, YouTube's live, LinkedIn's live. We are good to go. So while we wait, let me make a quick introduction to the brand. I launched Contino5 after spending 15 years in a variety of marketing roles. The brand focuses on SaaS brands utilizing HubSpot in their integrated marketplace. We offer a fractional subscription model that gives you access to unlimited marketing and revenue operations with no scopes, no quotes, and no billable hours. Simply submit and prioritize requests and then consider them done. We'll meet once a week to collaborate with your point of contact and share updates on requests and get feedback for upcoming work or answers if there are bottlenecks. So regardless if you're needing someone to simply segment and send out promotional emails to even building out a channel partner program, automating your customer lifecycle marketing, or measure attribution to understand what's actually working, it's all one simple subscription away. So now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into it. First and foremost, housekeeping. This video is being recorded and will be available on demand on the Contino5 website and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so that we can get access to all the bells and whistles there and make a better sharing experience for you. So that's housekeeping. Let's jump into today's topic, webinar experiences. So with that in mind, my promise is that by the end of this video, you'll be ready to build a better webinar experience that drives higher registrations, more engagement live, and a better post-show performance. So thinking through the agenda today, there are 4 main topics of discussion, including how to drive more registrations for your webinar, how to have better engagement during the live show, how to follow up post-show, and how to repurpose your webinar to capture even more attention. But before we jump into the meat and potatoes, I first want to say hey and share a little bit about who I am. I've spent the last 15 years working with numerous SaaS brands at different stages from seed funded to 50 million ARR. And on the other end, I've worked at corporate America working for brands like Red Hat and IBM, where I managed increasing landing page conversions and executing global marketing campaigns. With that in mind, I've seen how things work at the different extremes. And a quick fact about me, because we all love fun facts, I do get this question a lot, but yes, I actually do like operations and building systems. My personality is INTJ, so it's kind of my means of operating. However, I wasn't always this way. There was a time when I spent way too much time doing marketing and revenue operations manually. I didn't understand how one thing impacted another, especially in SaaS where a customer moves from one department to another, but each department builds upon the previous one. And more importantly, I didn't understand how to read the data to understand if what I was doing was actually working. I just did a lot of things and hoped something clicked. So thinking through the process of webinar experiences, you're not here to learn about Contino5. You're here to learn about myself. You want to learn how to build a better webinar experience. So let's move on to the common mistakes I see when working with brands. 4 mistakes in particular. So the first mistake I see a lot of brands do is barely promote their webinars. I never understood this when working with different brands. It seems like all we do is create a registration page and then email spam our entire database, inviting everybody, regardless of their role or function, with the same invite, and then pushing them to this registration page, oftentimes a Zoom registration page, which is terrible. And then maybe we'll share a few awkward social media posts. It just seems like we were missing the mark. The second mistake I see is, as a community leader, someone that's working with customers and potential buyers, I always seem like the host was kind of making their own agenda and making a lot of assumptions about what to share. A lot of times, especially in a SaaS environment, ask your customers what they want to hear from. This could be as simple as using a HubSpot chatbot or an intercom chatbot and posting a poll and just asking people, of these 4 different topics, what would you like to learn about next? I think a lot of times we don't invite our customers in on conversations and getting their feedback because we're afraid of what they're going to say. But feedback and listening is a superpower, and it's something that you need to tap into because it'll give you the best direction of what to create next, what webinar to host next, and be able to connect with your buyers a lot better. The third mistake I see a lot of brands is treating their webinars like a lecture where all they do is talk. Unfortunately for me right now, as you can see, I'm sharing with Riverside. I love Riverside as a little rabbit hole tangent. I love Riverside just because the video editing at the back end is superb. It allows me to do a lot of crazy things, which we'll talk about later in this webinar. But unfortunately, the webinar process isn't quite baked. So there isn't a lot of functionality right now. So unfortunately, this is going to be more lecture style, but hopefully soon they have released on their roadmap that they're building out webinar functionality where you'll see polls and engagements. We'll talk about this a lot more in the slides, but treating your webinars like a lecture it's beyond annoying. Like, how many times have you gotten on a webinar where all you're hearing is talk, 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 and 9 out of 10 times you're probably going to start multitasking because there's nothing to engage with, and then you start going down a rabbit hole where you're doing something in the background and you're listening to what they're saying, but you're not really connecting. By doing proper engagements, you'll be able to keep your audience a lot more captive and also allow them to interact with their peers, because the fact is that there's a lot of like-minded people on the call currently that if you're doing polls and chats and engagements and Q&As, like they're all very similar minded and probably all going through the same similar experiences, hence the reason why they're on our webinar. So allowing them to engage and network is just a bonus ad that you can provide for the people that join the call. And lastly, the fourth mistake I see brands doing is during the post show, the only thing they really do is they have the recorded webinar, they upload it to either YouTube or make an on-demand version on their website, and then they just kind of put it on the shelf and forget about it and then just move on to the next webinar. The fact is like you just did a crazy amount of effort creating this, like figuring out what to say, building your pitch deck, presenting it, hopefully getting feedback from your customers so that you can kind of make it a little better after the recording and maybe add some additional that Q&A on the on-demand version. Like, you just did all this effort. Like, I don't understand why brands literally just put it on a shelf, send out an email saying, hey, this is available for everybody that registered, and then you just kind of on to the next one. Like, there's so much you could do to repurpose this webinar and get a lot more reach. More to come. So as a recap, this is typically what the workflow looks like. So you create a registration page, you send out email invites and reminders, you have a webinar lecture, and then you host it on demand where you email it to everybody that registered, and then you kind of just rinse and repeat over and over and over. It works, but there's a better way. So let's get into it. So at this point, you might be wondering, okay, I know what to stop, but what should I be doing? And that's why you're here, right? To learn how to build a better webinar experience. So thinking through how to build a better webinar experience, we're going to kind of break this up into 4 sections. There's the pre-show, there's showtime, and then there's the post-show and amplification. Ideally, the ultimate web flow should look a little something like this, and it is not loading. Let me see if I can move something around a little bit. What is going on? Technical difficulties. All right, so I will send this over afterwards to everybody. Oh, there we go. Took a little minute. So I created this in video. This is what the ultimate webinar experience looks like and what we're going to be building to. As you can see, there's a lot more steps than just sending out an email invite to a registration page, hosting it on demand afterwards, and then moving on to the next one. As we go through this ultimate webinar flow, I'm literally going to break this down step by step so you kind of have a little bit of context as to what's going on at each stage. And the best part about this is if you're using HubSpot, you can literally create a workflow for your webinar experiences and automate this entire process post-registration, which ideally is a perfect world, because every time you do a webinar, you can literally clone the workflow, update the emails and the landing page for registration, and then just consider it done. No more sending out invites, no more sending out reminders. And let's get into it and kind of break this out piece by piece. So the first step that I think that will lead to a better webinar experience is that you need to be specifically sending out email promotions based on the function that you're talking to. The reality is in 2026, they're expecting that a staggering 376 billion emails are expected to be sent and received every single day. And on average, a person, especially a business people, receive 121 emails in their inbox every day. If you want yours to be read, you best be doing something to stand out. What this means is that you need to segment out your email invites for your webinar. Typically, what I do is I have your board executives, which would be a very high level email invite. You have your marketing managers, which is like, how is this going to impact my teams? And then the third function, especially in SaaS, is the users, who are probably going to be the ones that are actually using what you share in your webinar in their everyday life. How you do this is by using a template called Why This Matters to You. The idea here is to take your landing page. You probably have a headline and your fancy bullets and a little bit of leading description on what people are going to learn. But when you're sending out an email invite, instead of just copying that headline and the fancy bullets and pasting it in your email, what you need to do, and you could probably even use ChatGPT for this, is take all that information, send it over to ChatGPT, and then say, share this webinar with these details as though you're speaking to a CEO or a marketing manager or a marketing specialist, which would be your three levels, or depending on what functions you're talking about. But explain why this webinar matters to them. And that idea is that you're taking out all of the thought process. Like, people don't like to think, especially when they're getting bombarded with emails every single day. Like, play connect for and connect the dots for them, and saying, hey, like, I'm hosting this webinar and this is why it matters to you. And this is what you're going to get out of it. And it allows them to stop thinking through, like, all right, is this going to matter to me? Like, you're spoon feeding it to them. What this is going to do is that, especially if you tailor that with your subject lines, you're going to see higher open rates on your emails. And by saying why this matters to them, you're probably going to see a higher click through and registration, because you're connecting the dots for people. You're not just kind of making this very broad where there's a lot of assumptions, because let's remind ourselves, like with webinars, like you're just kind of screaming out to the void that, hey, I'm like sharing something, and you as the deep knowledge expert, like, know what you're going to say. But in that headline and those few bullet points, it's very hard for them to understand, like, all right, like, what am I going to learn? What am I going to get out of this? Is this going to matter to me? Is it worth my 45 minutes to an hour of me jumping on this call and actually giving them my attention? Because the reality is like, I'm getting pulled a million different ways. So why does this matter to me? Spoon feed it. Secondly, social media promotion. I don't understand why people don't do this very well, especially in a lot of the brands that I've worked with. It seems though you have your thumbnail, and again, you have your headline and your fancy bullet points. And for some reason, 9 out of 10 times, we just copy the landing page details and upload them to LinkedIn or social media, add a pretty thumbnail, and then hit send. And again, there's no context. There's no, why does this matter to me? What you need to be doing instead is sharing on social media. Like, this gives you the ability to provide context. A couple weeks ago, but a week ago, myself and Gina, if you haven't seen the webinar, we did a webinar on how to generate leads using LinkedIn without using posting or paid ads. And building up to the webinar, her and myself did a bunch of LinkedIn outreach where we were tapping into our network. We both have a fairly decent following, and she was sharing videos where she was sharing little gems and kind of context about what this webinar was going to be about, and then pushing them to the landing page to register to learn more. I was doing a lot more text-based. She's a lot more vocal. I don't like being in front of a camera. So mine are usually a lot of text-based, but I was sharing all of these little gems. And the idea here is that you're sharing all of these insights in your social media feeds, where let's admit, like, as a speaker, you probably have it as your speaker of the presentation or the host, you probably have a decent following on social media just because you're so forward facing that people know who you are and they connect with you. So using your network to extend the reach of this webinar that you're about to be on is going to increase registrations tenfold easy. And it's the idea that when you're posting, what you want to do is not just copy the headline and fancy bullets, but actually provide context. Again, like the emails, you're sharing why this matters. For us, me and Gina were both very wide open with what was going on. Like, we're one of those that both of us are kind of the oversharers, where we just share a lot of details. And we went into pretty good detail with these LinkedIn posts. If you want to jump on my profile, you can kind of check them out. They're still live. But the idea was to, like, provide a lot of insights that beg people to wonder, like, if you're giving me all this in a social media post, like, what's going to be on this webinar? Because curiosity is a powerful drug. So using that in mind, what you need to be doing is sharing a lot on social media leading up. And usually when I start social media promotions, at most think 2 weeks out, but leading up the week of, like, post heavily, get people to register, get in that calendar invite, because you know as well as I do, depending on who you're talking to, those calendars fill up fast. But going out any more than 2 weeks and people might register and then completely forget, which isn't good for you. So I usually say 2 weeks at most, but especially the week leading up. And the idea is, like I showed in the slide, act like a drug dealer, but don't sell drugs, sell gems. And then if they want more, to register for the webinar. Moving on. That was a little long-winded. I went a little more than I wanted to. The next thing that I think that everybody sleeps on is leveraging LinkedIn, especially if you're in a B2B play, and especially if you're in a B2B SaaS play. LinkedIn events always seem to be a promotional tactic that brands just slept on. LinkedIn has more than 1 billion users. And by creating an event, it not only allows you to tap in and leverage everybody that's on your network that will get a notification when you invite them to the webinar, but it also allows you to do boosting, where you can do a lookalike audience based on people that are following your page, or maybe a group of LinkedIn, or even potentially a competitor, or you could upload your customer list from your CRM into LinkedIn and say, hey, build a lookalike audience off of this. And what that's going to do is amplify your event across the entire LinkedIn network. LinkedIn events are free, so why not create it? The only caveat I would share with a LinkedIn event is that when you build an event with your company page, it does allow you to the ability to accept registrations using LinkedIn. This will increase your conversions because they can just click a button and be registered for the event. The drawback, though, is post-event, you get a CSV of everybody that registered, but the registration is whatever they use, their email and first name and last name, whatever that was they used to create their LinkedIn profile, that's what you're going to get in that CSV. And a lot of times it's a personal email address. So what I typically do is when it says, where do you want to push people to register? I usually push them to a registration page that I control, where in that email, I can say it has to be a business email address that doesn't end in Gmail or Hotmail or me.com or any of those free solutions, which you probably don't want. Because following up, you're going to be pushing to their personal email inbox, and that's not ideal, because I can only imagine if you think your business email is bad, depending on your role, it could be worse. But my personal inbox always seems a lot messier than my business inbox. But LinkedIn, leveraging it, create the page. You can actually create it for on a company profile page, and you can create it for your personal. On the company profile, you can list the speakers. So you can say who are the hosts and who's the guest. And then that also notifies that person's network. It's a great free way of leveraging your event. The next thing you're going to want to do to build a better webinar experience is stop using Zoom. If you're using Zoom, I mean, there's a lot of webinar platforms out there, but Zoom's usually the more popular one. Stop using their registration page. Nothing screams boring like pushing people to a Zoom landing page, registration page, whatever you want to call it. Instead, especially if you're a HubSpot user, take advantage of their free landing page builder. There are numerous templates out there that you can use. It's free. It can allow you to create the landing page, the form, the post follow-up. And what's nice is, especially if you're using HubSpot Professional, you get access to the workflows. That workflow process that I was talking about earlier, you could trigger off of this form registration on this landing page. And then afterwards, you can push that registration information to Zoom or any of the other webinar platforms. But then you can also have all your other triggers that we'll talk about later in this webinar. But post-registration, I typically would want to send them to a confirmation page where you say thank you and tell them to check their inbox to ensure the registration went through, which is a nice little nudge. I feel like so many people, it's like you register for a webinar and then it's just that default, like, thank you for registering. And it's like, you have somebody's undivided attention. Like, they just took an action that you wanted them to take. Like, share gratitude, because gratitude always compounds. For me, post-registration, I always, like, if you downloaded this or you download a future webinar, I always send them to a thank you page where I say, thank you for wanting to attend this and taking time out of your schedule. Check your inbox, add it to your calendar. And then afterwards on that landing page, I also share a bunch of About Us articles where people can learn more about Continuify and myself as the founder. And because you have your attention, they're interested in you. It kind of builds a little context, because they're like, all right, who's this person that's going to be hosting this? So by providing those additional blog posts, it actually like provides that validation and kind of social proof of like, hey, here's who I am. This is my experience. This is probably like you already registered, but here's kind of an even more validation of why you registered, because you're going to be hearing from me and this is my experience. It's a nice little value add. And like I said, gratitude always compounds. So just say thank you for someone taking the action that you want them to take. Next up in a better webinar experience, the post-registration email. Like for me, when I'm building this out, I know you can set the automated reminders with Zoom or any of the other webinars. I usually turn that off because I want to control. I'm kind of a little control freak. It's an INTJ or INTJ tick. For me, it's like I want to control what those reminders look like. In building better context, as you can see with the bullet points here, what I tend to do is immediately after registering for the webinar, I send a confirmation, obviously with the event details and a way for them to add to the calendar. But again, like the landing page confirmation where I'm sharing the blogs to learn more about me, in that confirmation email with the event details, I'm not doing it right now, but I will be sharing a video that kind of explains who I am and my experience, kind of similar to what I shared earlier in this webinar, where I was like, hey, here's who I am. Here's what I've done. Here's some of the brands I've worked with in the past. Kind of gives a little context and again, more validation that, hey, you made the right decision joining this webinar. It's also a great way that if you're doing a collaboration with a guest, that if people haven't been engaging with your webinars quite a bit, they know who you are, but they might not know who your guest is. So while you're collaborating with your guests, and obviously you're jumping on meetings priorhand to discuss what you're wanting to talk about, have them record, like ask them a couple questions and have them record like a 2-3 minute video that you can edit later and repurpose that explains who they are, what they do, and why they're on your show or why they're part of your webinar experience. This allows you to build that validation and again, that context that, hey, here's this guest. You don't know them from Adam, but I approve of them, obviously, because I invited them to my webinar, but here's a little more about who they are so you can kind of get an idea of where they're coming from and what they speak to. This also builds more validation for the webinar itself, but it builds the credibility that, hey, like this is a person that you need to listen to, and this is why. Also, 3 days prior, building upon that context, a lot of times, like I shared, when people are jumping on a webinar, they have no idea what you're going to speak to. Like outside of that headline and the fancy bullet points, obviously you're hopefully building context in email and building context on social media. But even building up to the webinar, I like to do framing where it kind of like, a lot of times, like it's like a dream. Like how often have you ever dream where you have as soon as you start the dream, you're in the middle of something, but you don't have the slightest idea how you got there. That's kind of how a webinar experience is. It's like you register for something and you showed up, but it's like, where am I? How did I get here? What's going on? Like you're trying to calibrate yourself. By 3 days prior, sharing blog posts or maybe even some short videos that you record, you can kind of lay that framework that, hey, like this is what to expect. And you could share the agenda and like outside of the few bullet points or the fancy bullet points that you already shared, you kind of build upon them to lay a better foundation of like, all right, here's where we're starting. So we're not just joining this dream and having no idea what's going on, but instead, like, here's what's going on. And this is what you need to know. Like, how adept are you with this? Like, do you have experience with this? Are you completely new to this? And that kind of gives you an idea of like how much you need to lay at the beginning of your webinar to build a better experience. And then building upon that, I go into the tomorrow reminder, which is the 24 hours before the event. This is a reminder to say, hey, like you have an event tomorrow. But in this email, I ask them seed questions. How often have you joined a webinar that at the very end, obviously you want to have that Q&A, but you're like, I don't know what to ask. And people are asking questions and you're kind of like, this is awkward. A great way to get around that is in this reminder, asking them to answer some poll questions or open-ended questions that could be sending them to a type form where you ask them specific questions or challenges that they hope that the webinar will address. To ask them again what their experience is or their familiarity of what you're going to be talking about. And then is also what are their current goals or objectives that they're hoping to be able to achieve by attending your webinar. This allows you to kind of think through some of those pre-built pre-built seed questions that you could have at the end of the webinar instead of you kind of making assumptions about what people want to ask. Right here, you're kind of getting pre-built seed questions that people are hoping that you address during the webinar. And some of it you probably will address during the webinar, but other things it might prompt you to, hey, I didn't really think about that or that perspective or that outcome. And it's perfect for seed questions at the end of the Q&A. So that's the tomorrow's reminder. And then of course the live in 1 hour, usually the name of the webinar. And then I put at the end, it's a virtual event because it's a webinar, kind of like allows them to kind of segment out their inbox. But it's nice to do that 1 hour before because people tend to get busy during their life. And even though hopefully they added the event to your calendar, that email invite serves as just a gentle nudge that, hey, like you subscribed for this or registered for this, as well as it gives them the link front and center that they can just kind of click and join the call real quick. So that is the better context. By doing that, hopefully people will have a better understanding of what they're getting themselves into. You have they can set better expectations about what you're going to deliver and the outcomes they're going to receive. And overall, it just creates a better webinar experience. So moving into showtime. So during showtime, live engagements, like I shared earlier, Riverside is still early on. It started out as a recording only software. So there really wasn't a lot of, there's not a lot of engagement possibility. Obviously we have the chat that you can jump into, but there's no like Q&A submissions. I can't do polls yet or virtual whiteboards, but these are all things that your typical Zoom webinars have the ability to do. I mean, simple engagements can be at the very beginning of the webinar, just asking who people are and what their job function is. And you could give them, especially if you're waiting and wasting time kind of at the beginning as people are filling into the room and you're working on your live streams, if you're pushing out to LinkedIn or YouTube, use the chat as a means of people being able to network. It's a great little value add that people can share their name and their business in their little 30-second pitch in the chat. People can kind of get an understanding of like the people that are in the room, and it could potentially create networking, which is always like, you obviously want them to buy something from you, but that little value add, like people being able to network, people like it builds goodwill for your brand if you do all these little things that over deliver on what people expect. And a lot of times, like people don't even ask that question. Like the chat just sits there quiet. During the housekeeping, tell people to ask Q&A. I usually would do that if I was on Zoom, that say, hey, like if you have any questions, there's a Q&A function in Zoom or most of your webinar platforms. Submit your questions there. We could potentially ask them as or answer them as we're going through the call, or we'll be sure to address a majority of them. If there's a lot, we'll address a majority of them at the end of the call. So that gives them reason to stay towards the end. Another great thing is polls. Again, you have a lot of like-minded people on the call. They want to understand how, and most people are competitive, so they want to understand how they are gauging against their peers. So maybe doing some polls that are a little more competitive, like, are you doing this or are you not doing this? How far are you on in this journey? Are you familiar with this? Yes or no? Or it could be a scale. Yes, I'm very familiar. I'm already doing this. I have no idea how to do this. Those types of questions kind of allows them to understand where they're at in the world and kind of do soft comparisons. Another great thing to do is virtual whiteboards. I've seen this done a few times, especially in sales demos, not so much in webinars, but it's amazing when it happens. Like for instance, I had one demo that I jumped on, and instead of having a pitch deck, we jumped in Miro. And if you're not familiar with virtual whiteboards, two good ones are Miro and Mural, are two great platforms that you can kind of check out after this. But instead of having a pitch deck, we jumped into Miro. And as we were engaging, he's literally taking notes. And then he had a couple polls in there that I was kind of interacting with. And it kind of just made the experience more interactive instead of me just kind of sitting there and again, hearing this lecture that nobody wants to sit there, and you kind of get exhausted and then your mind starts wandering. By doing all of these little engagements like virtual whiteboards, polls, and asking people to engage in the chat, it brings them back to the webinar because they hear something. They're like, oh, I don't want to have FOMO and I feel left out. I need to add my perspective. So then they jump back into the experience, and then they're paying attention to what you're sharing versus kind of like trailing off and multitasking and doing other things. So all of these little engagements not only creates a better webinar experience for everybody that's on, because it allows them to engage with their peers and kind of understand more of what's going on, but it also keeps people on the live call instead of multitasking. So that is showtime. So thinking through the webinar experience post-show, without fail, the last few companies I worked with have set this up, and it is wonders what it does and how many people sleep on it. So the reality is that you just had someone's captive attention for 45 minutes. Do you know how rare that is in our goldfish attention span world to have? I mean, maybe multitasking, but they were listening to you for 45 minutes. And I don't understand why so many people post webinar, again, all they do is download the video out of whatever the webinar, they throw it in their editing, they edit it a little bit, throw it on demand. And then the only follow-up post webinar is, hey, here's the on-demand version. Hope you like it. And then again, we rinse and repeat and move on to the next webinar. I never understood why you just had someone's captivated attention. They were very much interested in a very specific topic that you were just speaking to for 45 minutes. Like, follow up with them. Like, it's crazy how many people have don't master the art of follow up. Like, I remember reading a stat the other day by Gong that said, I think it was like 48% of salespeople never follow up after like the first initial, like, I'm not interested. And like, obviously there's that I'm not interested and like, I'm pissed, not interested. But the reality is, like, especially when you think of the 95-5 rule, like 5% of the market's ready to buy, 95% is either not even problem aware, or they're just not ready to make a decision now. And it's the same thing with webinars. Like, you just had their attention for 45 minutes. Like, follow up, like, say, and it could be, and again, this can be automated with that workflow that an hour after the webinar's over, send them a short email, and you can have this sent from marketing or the person that hosted the webinar. Or if you have lead assignment in your CRM, you could actually send these emails from the salespeople and just make sure that you give context to the salespeople, like, hey, this is what I spoke to. These are the main points, so they can have an idea like what to share if someone does reply to them. But simply just sending an email an hour after webinar saying, hey, like, I'm glad you joined the webinar. Again, gratitude. Glad you joined the webinar. I know we learned a lot. And simply leaving it open. And do you have any other additional questions that I can answer, or something I can provide a little more context around, or a little more strategic application, depending on how far you deep dived into the webinar? That a lot of times people are going to reply, and it gives you a great ability to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody where you're actively talking with them, and instead of just this open-ended webinar experience where, yeah, you can chat with them, but the reality is like, it's not a one-on-one conversation. And you can even source these to your BDR teams or your SDRs, depending on what you want to do. But having this follow-up sequence, and again, it's all automated if you set the workflow up to just say, hey, like, we just had this call. I'm glad you joined. I know we provided a lot. Do you have any additional questions? And a lot of people will follow up. And that gives you the ability that, depending on how deep you want to go with the conversation, this could get pushed into a sales demo where people are like, hey, like, you have a webinar that's a little high level, and it's like, hey, I actually want to know how this works, functionality, like, and outcomes and capabilities. And a salesperson be like, well, let's jump into a demo and I can actually show you how this works. And then off to the sales pitch. And it's a great way, but so many people like kind of sleep on this. And I think if you do it right, it's great. Obviously, don't use it as a sales tactic. It's a education value add. If you push it sales, it's probably going to get ignored, but you can do it indirectly that it ends in a sales outcome if you do it correctly. And like I said, gratitude. Any additional questions, answer the questions. Depending on how deep they want to go, it could turn into a sales demo. So thinking past post-show, webinar repurposing. It's funny the last few years how many people started doing this, and it used to be extremely difficult to edit and be able to repurpose and also understand like what points you should be sharing. But these days, especially with your better like webinar softwares, it's gotten very good at understanding, especially I think Wistia just released a webinar platform that does this extremely well, because you get all their video analytics on the back end, and you can actually see when people are paying attention, and not so much audio, but also is the tab active and they're looking at your deck. Don't quote me on this, but I'm almost certain that's the capabilities that you get with the new Wistia webinars. So that literally gives you the ability to know exactly what parts you should repurpose based on the or what's the word I'm looking for? The captivity, how captive your audience is, that you can do it that way. Me personally, I use Riverside, and I'm going to throw the link up here if you want to check it out. Let me add it there. So I'm obviously using Riverside to record this, but you also can use Riverside or Opus Clip to repurpose. What it's going to allow you to do is upload your webinar to their platform, and it's going to use AI to kind of look at the influxes of your voice, your cadence, where you pause. If there's emotional release, like you laugh, like ha ha ha, it'll probably pick up on that, and it'll create all of these mini clips for your webinar. And what that allows you to do is create your social reels and your LinkedIn shorts and your YouTube shorts. It allows you to create like a 16:9 version if you want to share it to LinkedIn or Facebook or any of the other social platforms. But webinar repurposing has come a long way. And instead of just having the on-demand version, instead repurpose. Obviously, you're gonna build your on-demand version page where you host your on-demand version video, but repurposing and creating all these mini clips where you kind of share the highlight reels and then sharing them to social and pushing to that on-demand page will allow you to extend the reach so much further. Because the reality is like, you can get some attention with the registration, but again, all they're seeing is this headline and a few fancy bullets and maybe some additional context when you email invite them or the social media invites at the very beginning. But actually seeing live video of what you were presenting, and hopefully it's the highlight reels, seeing that live kind of validates what you were offering a lot more than just text or maybe some short video clips where you're kind of providing a little context about what you're wanting to speak to, but at the same time you weren't wanting to provide too much because then people wouldn't have to join your webinar. But with these, it's like you're wanting to give them a view of what is the whole webinar, but here's the highlight reels. It's kind of like social media anyways. It's a bunch of highlight reels, but providing that on social media and then driving to your on-demand is going to amplify the on-demand experience. And then again, thinking through that one step further, once you repurpose and draw into the on-demand, post webinar and post someone joining and watching the on-demand version, the next step of a better webinar experience, I'm getting ahead of myself, kind of trying to connect the dots, is over delivering. So after the initial outreach of, hey, what were your thoughts about the webinar, and the follow-up questions and seeing if there's anything additional that they need. Another great way that I feel like a lot of brands sleep on, especially with the webinar experience, is by doing what I call a 5 more minutes blog post. And the idea here is that the concept and strategy is that you had a webinar and you had your context that kind of went down the rabbit hole. Think of Alice in Wonderland. And then you had the webinar where you kind of went down the rabbit hole a little more. With this 5 more minutes, especially building off of the repurposed content of what was the best parts of the webinar, you could go down and provide 5 more minutes of going down even further into the rabbit hole. And this can also build off of the follow-up questions. If you see a lot of people post webinar when you're reaching out to them and having the same questions of like, hey, like you were talking about this on the webinar, but you never really answered XYZ, this 5 more minutes could be the answer of that XYZ. And it even just builds a lot more. And again, you can schedule this out. I typically schedule it out 3 days after that initial follow-up. So the experience would be they watch the webinar live, an hour later, you send the, hey, do you have any more questions? And then 3 days later, you send this 5 more minutes blog post where it even dives deeper into something that you shared on the webinar. From an on-demand perspective, As soon as they watch the on-demand experience, it's the same flow. An hour later, after they watch on-demand, and only schedule this to do once. So if they watch the on-demand multiple times, don't every single time have this workflow say, "Hey, you have any more questions? Hey, you have any more questions?" Just set it up to trigger once, but ask them, "Do you have any additional questions?" And then 3 days later, provide them with a deeper, this 5 more minutes more like deep dive blog post where you're even sharing more context. And it could be based on, again, something where there was a lot of captive viewers on the live call, or during this, do you have any more questions? Email. If a lot of people reply with the same question or a very similar question, that very much alludes to what this 5 more minutes blog should be. And then this allows you to over deliver on the webinar experience. Like, it allows you to create more value. It's also going to help you with your lead scoring if you do that with if you do lead scoring on the back end, that, hey, you got them to join a webinar, they're clicking a bunch of emails, and now you have them clicking on an email to look at a blog post. You could also potentially gate this if you want, if it's something of real value. And then, of course, that's going to increase your lead score even more. And then lastly, after all of this is done and you have this 5 more minutes blog, I typically wait another 3 days. And I usually only send during the weekdays. So take your weekends out, like Saturday, Sunday, take out. So 3 days can be like, if they saw it on a Thursday, then it's going to go Friday, Monday, and then send on Tuesday. But 3 days later, I just kind of send this kind of open-ended, hey, like, I feel like I've shared with you a lot. Here's a recap. You watched the webinar where you learned this. You were able to answer these questions. A lot of people had these questions. Here's like a FAQ accordion of all the common questions that people had, so everybody can kind of get an idea of all the questions that were asked. And there's a Q&A there. Post email, and then also say, hey, like, we're going to be moving on to the next webinar, but if there is anything else that you need answered for this, don't hesitate to reply. Again, this is kind of like, they got all of this value. They've had time to kind of digest it all. And then again, just like that, the follow-up questions, this could be something that alludes into, all right, like, I got a good idea of what's going on here. They provided a lot of value. They obviously know what they're doing, and it could end up turning into a sales call. And the whole purpose of this little post flow is, the reality is like I shared, you have attention, and your salespeople already want to reach out. Every single company I've always worked for, it seemed like if anybody kicked a tire, the sales team wanted to reach out to them and say, hey, like, I saw you just did this. Is there anything I could follow up? And by doing this, again, like I shared, you can send this out via your salespeople based on the lead assignment or the contact assignment, so that anytime they do reply, they're replying to sales, but you're automating this on the sales behalf, and you're probably doing it a lot better than, no offense, salespeople, but you're probably doing it a lot better than saying, hey, saw you attended this webinar, want to chat? You're actually, like, in these situations, providing value. You're providing the 5 more minutes. You're providing this at the very end, a recap of all of the additional Q&A that people submitted. So like I shared, you're sharing a lot of value. You're over delivering, that people are like, all right, like, I feel like I'm obliged to have a conversation with these people and see what else I can get out of this, versus just saying, hey, I saw you booked a webinar. You joined. Do you have any questions? Love to have a conversation with you. And then everybody's just like, this is going to be a sales call. So this allows you to build a better webinar experience. So that is the whole flow. Thinking one step further, if you have HubSpot, they have a new capability called Content Remix. And I haven't personally used this, but I wanted to make a call out. If you have Content Professional, you have to have the professional level of HubSpot. But there is a new capability called Content Remix, where it is AI powered. And what it does is you kind of prompt it like ChatGPT, but on the back end, I'm pretty sure it uses the software HeyGen, and I think there's maybe like 1 or 2 other softwares that are integrated with HubSpot. But what it's going to do is allow you to do this 5 minutes more blog post. It's going to allow you to create images. It's going to create advertisements for you. It's going to create social media posts for you. It's going to create the registration landing page for you. It's going to create SMSs if you want to invite people with text messages, and then also the email invites. So basically, like I said, I haven't shared it personally. It's something I want to deep dive into. I just wanted to share it so that you're aware of it. But uh, it basically allows you to create everything that you would need for this better webinar experience within a few clicks of a buttons, just using prompts. And then, of course, all the social media posts and email invites, it's all going to be tailored with your brand. And it's going to be built for the native channel so that you're not just taking, again, thinking back at the very beginning where most people just headline, fancy bullets, and then this awkward thumbnail that always looks weird on social media. Instead, it's going to allow you to create better invites, better post-show follow-ups. It could help you build that 5 more minutes blog. Definitely check it out. Definitely be sure to follow my profile because this is something I'm going to deep dive into here shortly. That if you want my take on it, I'll share my insights there. But check it out. So as a recap, what we've learned today. First, we spoke about the 4 mistakes people make when building out a webinar experience that typically leads to low engagement and low registrations and poor follow-up. We worked through those 4 common issues. We learned how to drive more registrations for your social media using LinkedIn events, social media promotion, and better email invites. We learned how to drive more engagement during the live presentation by using polls and virtual boards, by using the chat to allow people to network and engage with one another and get additional value out of the webinar, more than just the webinar itself. We learned how to follow up post-show to drive more conversations with sales. And then lastly, we learned how to repurpose your webinar to extend its reach using either Riverside or Opus Clips or even the new HubSpot content remix functionality. So if you're already like, all right, I'm excited to start using this, leave the I'm already building in the comments. I'm excited to see who's going to start maybe not using all of the components of this webinar experience, but maybe some of it, just to enhance the webinar experience a little bit. And lastly, if you are wanting someone to help you build out that webinar workflow that you can clone for every webinar, if you reach out to me at nextstops@continofy.com, we can have a conversation, and I'd be more than happy to have a conversation about what that workflow could look like. If you want me to build it out for you personally so that you can kind of just plug and play and have the templates in place for the email invites, the follow-ups, the repurposing. I can share links to Riverside or Opus Clips and kind of give you behind the scenes on what that looks like. Like I shared, email me at nextsteps@continofy.com, mention the webinar in the subject line, and we can have a conversation around that. So that concludes the webinar. If there are any additional questions, feel free to jump in the chat and I will answer anything that anybody has. Thanks again, everybody, for joining the webinar. I hope you got a lot out of this on how to build a better, or how to build the ultimate webinar experience. This is something I'm excited to build out for myself. As you can see, there's a lot of functionality that I wasn't able to bake into here just because of where Riverside's at. I contemplated using Zoom, but I just personally like Riverside. Like, I like the fact that it records at 4K. I don't have to download and then re-upload to Riverside or Opus Clip. Like, everything's right there. So within a few clicks of a button, like, I'm recorded, I am ready. I have all my repurposed content for social media. And then literally all I got to do is export out of Riverside and upload to YouTube. And then I have my on-demand version and we're good to go. And then of course, all the social repurposing, it's all AI. So it's looking at, like I shared, all the inflections and cadences. And if you pause and trying to find those highlight reels for you on your behalf. Of course, you can edit it afterwards if you're like, this is missing something, or I want to go back a little bit. You can add to that highlight reel and then export your 16:9 and your vertical. I can't remember what the format is for that. And you're off to the races. So definitely check out Riverside, or Opus Clips is another really popular one that's going hard. They're both great platforms that both use AI to get you that repurposed content. But yeah, I think this is going to conclude it, everybody. Not seeing anybody in the chat. But if you have any further questions that come to mind, like I shared, next steps at Continuify, or you can jump on the website, book a strategy session, and I'd be more than willing to have a conversation. Till the next one. Check you guys later. See ya.